Welcome to our lesson on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So in the short run, we know there are a lot of fluctuations. So this is a look at the unemployment rate for the past about 40 years. And there are wild swings in the unemployment rate, right, where it spikes up, corresponding, really each time basically with the recessions. In the short run, there are some pretty wild fluctuations. And economists would try to figure out why this happens. So, within the classical view of economics, right, there's a separation of variables into the real things that matter, right, production and growth, and then the nominal variables. And the nominal things shouldn't really matter, right? It shouldn't matter whether we count our money in terms of dollars or cents, right? If we talked about making $30,000 in a year or 3 million pennies in a year, right? I mean, if you use the same scale, if you use a different scale, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't affect the real variables. So changes in the money supply shouldn't matter. In the long run, classical theory holds pretty well. Changes in the money supply are only going to affect prices. It shouldn't affect anything else. It shouldn't affect gross domestic product. It shouldn't affect unemployment. But in the long run, money neutrality is no longer an appropriate assumption. So these nominal variables that sometimes we would suspect shouldn't matter in the short run, these variables that we would suspect shouldn't matter in the long run, they'll matter in the short run. So changes in the money supply can push real gross domestic product away from its long run trend. It can make it smaller than what you would expect for recessions, or sometimes they make it even larger, unsustainably large at times. And the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, this is used by economists to help explain some short-run fluctuations in economic activity. When we first do these, they should look somewhat similar. Our aggregate demand curve is going to be a downward sloping demand curve, only it's going to be in the aggregate. Instead of quantity, we're going to be looking at gross domestic product, and instead of one price for one product, we're going to be looking at the price level in the economy. So the aggregate demand curve shows the level of real GDP purchased by households, businesses, government, and foreigners at different possible price levels during a specific time period. Our aggregate demand curve, we well expect it to slope downward, just like the demand curve slopes downward. Now, why do we expect the aggregate demand to slope downward? Well, if the price level falls, right, price drops, quantity increases. That's what we assume for a regular demand curve, or demand curve within microeconomics. Within macroeconomics, we would assume a fall in the price level increases quantity of goods and services in the short run because consumers seem wealthier, right? If price level falls, consumers seem wealthier, stimulates the demand for consumption goods. If the price level falls, interest rates can fall. Interest rates, we would expect that to fall, which would stimulate more investment. And fall in the price level means currency is worth less, which means foreigners can buy the currency more easily. And if foreigners can buy the currency more easily, they can buy products more easily, which should increase demand for net exports. So those are a few reasons why you would expect our aggregate demand to slope downward. This is just the opposite issue, is what happens if the price level rises, the opposite of what we just saw. So our aggregate demand curve, expect would slope downward. So a decrease in the price level, well, should increase the quantity of goods and services demanded. So as we see on the bottom here, a fall in the price level increases the quantity of goods and services demanded from our level of GDP Y1 to our level of GDP Y2. So this should look familiar. The rationale for why it's downward sloping is a little different than just the standard demand curve, but other than that, this should look somewhat familiar from just our analysis of demand. The components of the aggregate demand curve are the same components of gross domestic product, consumption, interest rates, government spending, and net exports. Government spending, we assume, is not affected by the price level, but everything else is, right? Price level drops and you have a certain amount of wealth, you're now wealthier. Interest rates can change, net exports can also change. So those items can cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve can shift as well, just like our demand curve can shift, right? If there's changes in consumption patterns to change the aggregate demand curve, changes in investment, changes in government purchases, changes in net exports, all of them can shift the aggregate demand curve one way or the other. So all of these can shift, all four of these effects could shift the aggregate demand curve one way or the other. And with this, we're going to stop part 1, and we will see you again in part 2.